It seems like Eva is not ready for a discussion right now, so maybe we can do some feedback on the different sessions. If there's anyone who would like to give some thoughts about what they discussed, maybe Marta, if you want to shed some words on what you did, because I know you have to leave at 1, so...
Thank you very much. Very quick, we've been talking about land stewardship, the strategy that we have in Catalonia to promote agreements between landowners and NGOs with the help of the government, but the government trying not to interfere is something that it's done between the landowners and NGOs to promote the best management of the land and to promote biodiversity in natural protected areas, but not only. Also in other areas that has environmental interest as well. And also, but few, a little bit about the program of green infrastructure that we have in Catalonia, that we are starting it. We have some projects already done, and we are trying to execute them with some fundings from all around Europe and also from the government of Catalonia and the government of Spain. But I think that that's the land stewardship that now we it could be supported by the European Commission also, that it could be a strategy for...
Ilko, come on. Regarding Europe, sorry, mixing up. Where's Ilko? Yeah, in the back, yeah. Yes, please, yeah. Sorry, I didn't prepare you for this, but we just... It's like a live TV show. It is a live TV show, yeah. Just use the mic, thanks.
Yeah. Yes?
So what happened at your session?
Well, yeah.
Just top of mind.
Yeah, no, yeah. I was just, I started off with saying that I didn't want to do all the talking, which I tried to, but didn't fully succeed. So we ended up most interesting part. But no, I've given a brief insight in how we do our scoping of areas, of business models, of existing enterprises. And how we look at when an enterprise, and we finance enterprises as part of our enterprise program, when we finance these enterprises, and what makes them interesting in a rewilding or in a conservation context. So we discussed a couple of business models around hunting, around fishing, around forestry, tourism obviously, and looked at what are the elements that you have to assess and what makes such a business an interesting business for conservation enterprise.
One question I always want to ask, but I never dare to do it, is how much resistance do you get as Rewilding Europe if you go to such a local community and you say, like, you need to rewild, and here's some ideas, and here's some money, here's some funds, here's... You steal the hearts, or you convince them to actually do what you actually want to do?
Well, I wouldn't be able to answer it in that way, because that's...
Yeah.
If we do it that way, we wouldn't be very successful.
But it might be perceived as such.
No, yeah, but you have to manage your perception carefully. Mm-hmm. I think the key thing is we work with local people. I mean, we're often seen, we see ourselves as a European organization, but we have these areas. We work in those areas with people from the areas that know the areas, that tap into the local networks. If we wouldn't do that, we had no chance of surviving, because we cannot walk into an area and say, well, there's an interesting business there, an interesting business. You need to know the people, their reputation, and to be honest, in a lot of those areas, it's also about tapping into the right networks, and those are often very informal networks. And yeah, as a foreigner, you can walk in there, you can maybe, if you're lucky, you can sense that the networks are there, but there's no way that you will ever understand how they work and what strings to pull. You need local people to do that, and it makes you much more efficient if you do that. And ideally, you try to do it, like you said, so you want to do it on the top level. You work, with local governments, but also central, local business owners, local landowners.
Patience and listening and talking.
Yeah, especially patience. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Willem, we're still talking here when everyone came back. So.
Yeah, I think what I did is trying to explain how we work in southern Spain, where we work on first on a mobilization stakeholder process and then on a business development process in a large area, 630,000 2 years ago. And there were good questions coming up from the audience on business modeling, the role of government, acceptance as a foreigner. But we work with local team. Also, we started with local team and how we scouted that area, basically on a set of criteria where land tenure is an important one. But we also started there, and that helps to work with the local community by saying that we wanted to stay there for 20 years. And that sounds crazy, and people sometimes say we are crazy, but those questions were addressed, but it is a strong way. I think another question was on the different tool set we use, financial and technical tool set and psychological tool set. I think Rewilding Europe was talking about stakeholders. Now, this is a key thing, of course. How to... It works in a transformative way. And that's, of course, an important point. A transformative way of thinking and working with the local culture is a key asset to make sure that restoration will take place. With finance and technical tools, you will not be able to restore degraded land because most of it is owned by people.
And after these 2 years, have you seen the minds changing a bit?
What we've seen is that after these 2 years now there is an association of landowners and local national parks as well as public offices, mayors, an association of, they call it the For Returns Association of that Altiplano, that area. And workshops themselves, they now, together with us, identify potential setup of new companies. We call them restoration companies in marketing, in processing of almonds, composting, rotational grazing, and these kind of things. So we see that they increasingly take the initiative, and that's exactly what's needed because the area is going down the drain, basically.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Good luck with your mission. And then finally, Johnny Hughes, what happened? Just use the mic, thanks.
Probably heard enough of me, to be honest.
Can you sit here because of the camera?
Okay.
It's for the web streaming.
Right. Yeah. So maybe I can ask the people that attended our small but perfectly gathered session to chip in. But I'll give you a couple of statistics first. So we were talking about peatlands and particularly the peatland code, which is a mechanism for trying to attract private investment into the restoration of degraded peatlands in the UK, run under the auspices of the IUCN National Committee for the UK. Every year, over 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents escape from damaged peatlands in the UK. So just to give you a kind of flavour of what that means, that's the equivalent of 2/3 of all the greenhouse gas savings made by the UK each year. So unless we fix the peatland problem, we're not really going to fix the issue of climate change emissions in the UK. A further just 5% extra losses of our peatlands, if we don't bring them into good condition, would equate to the total UK anthropogenic emission. That's the kind of scale of the challenge that we've got in the UK. Actually, in the UK comes from these PT catchments as well. So we've got 75% of all peatland catchments. So that was just a bit of a scene setter, and then we talked about a little bit about the peatland code, which is this mechanism, as I say, under the IUCN UK peatland programme. 100 hectare, the restoration of a 100 hectare site. So thankfully, you've got a visual image of what these damaged bogs look like. The greenhouse gas savings on a 100 hectare site over a 30-year period after restoration amount to around about 22,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents. That's the equivalent of about 12,000 cars, annual emissions from about 12,000 cars. And the restoration cost of that is around about 200,000. So the current carbon market value in 2016, that's a little bit more than the current current price of carbon. But if the price of carbon just nudges up a little bit further, it would become profitable very quickly to do this.
And then who pays for the restoration projects now? Is it governments or is it private?
Most of the money for peatland restoration is from public sources. It's from government, yeah. So the Scottish government
And we thought that
has invested around about 18 million over the last 3 years in peatland restoration. But that's a fraction of what we need, and obviously private investment is.
But they're very useful for controlling water levels in certain areas. It must have been much easier now to sell restoration of peatlands, right? I mean, because you guys suffered tremendously in the last few years over.
Yeah, I think the relationship after heavy rainfall events and intact peatlands is there's still research ongoing, and there does seem to be some effect in smoothing the peak flow curve out, but most of the benefits at the moment that we're focusing on anyway, the most compelling argument is actually the carbon argument.
That's a very compelling one. Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know if anybody else wants to reflect on our discussions or add anything. I'm just one voice, really. We had a very interesting and rich
For
discussion.
now, your voice is interesting because we can actually go to Luxembourg now.
Okay.
I mean,
Right.
there's a connection. It's like okay. Thanks, Johnny. And just before we go to lunch, if you want to stay, we'll finish with some thoughts on the capital, the financing protocol. I don't remember the financing facility. Thank you very much. So Eva, we're going to call you now. I know you're on the web stream, and hope it works. Hi, Eva.
Can you hear me?
Through the speakers?
Hi.
Yeah? Yeah. Hi, Eva. You're on the phone. Okay, well, we're all waving at you now. So, without further ado, what would you like? Most of the discussions on the web stream, and please share some thoughts about how the EIB looks at this whole discussion. Thank you. Floor is yours.
I think that actually said quite a bit of what I wanted to say, and in a sense have addressed some of the key issues. And one very good point that I subscribe to that Willem addressed was that there are many policies out there, declarations of intent. The rhetoric is there in terms of how to support or involve the private sector in natural capital, in biodiversity protection and conservation, but very little is still happening on the ground. So if some of the institutions that are active or are players in the sphere are still very much in the incubating phase. We are still in the early testing efforts. There has been in the last couple of years with, for example, at European level, the implementation of the NCFF, the Natural Capital Financing Facility, to scale up. But these are all ad hoc attempts. And we need to move from these ad hoc scale-up attempts to more standardized and mainstream scaling approaches. But there are a number of barriers. And the first one, I think, was addressed from someone in the audience, is a question of indicators. How do you measure, impacts, conservation impacts, and so on. There's a plethora of indicators, not all very coherent, not all aligned. So we need to address this issue. But part of this issue is valuation of natural capital. And it is an imperative that we do go down this route. One thing is it has a double benefit. One is that often nature's value is quite invisible to society. And in order to actually make that visible and the importance of natural capital to a sustainable economic growth, we need to start valuing it. And you can't measure, I think you've all heard the phrases that you can't manage what you don't measure. And therefore, the work that, for example, the Natural Capital coalition and under the declaration and the protocol we're doing is this whole piece of valuation work. It has started. You have waves. You have the UN SEEA, but it needs to gain a lot more momentum. We need to internalize those costs. EIB has been looking at how to integrate externalities and especially impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems into our own cost-benefit analysis, and hopefully that will have an impact on our decision-making process in terms of the projects that we finance. And we've been working closely with the European Environment Agency as well as Eurostat in looking at the different methodologies out there and seeing which one is appropriate at project level and which one would be appropriate to elevate at or let's say government level, so that they start taking their accounting systems and into their budgets. But a fundamental issue that I even find within my own institution is maybe don't have, I mean, there are very few of us who work in this sphere, but I don't have, let's say, my senior management on board or fully on board. They've acknowledged it, you know, they make very high or participate in very high declarations, but it hasn't trickled down through the and I think it's true for most of our institutions, and I'm talking about the multilateral development banks and other development financing institutions, is that it's still seen as a Cinderella subject. We are volume driven, let's face it, and these natural, or let's say these projects generate very little revenue. There's a low volume, so generally, I mean, if you take the EIB as an example, we do direct investments only for projects with an average size total project cost of 15 million, and they are resource intensive. The amount of time you have to spend, you spend the same amount of time on a small project than you do on a large project. So for an institution like the EIB, it's very difficult to convince management, or that the management has the appetite to actually do such projects. So that's at an institutional level. At a, let's say, more general level, what we found through our work under the is that the projects are definitely much smaller. Although we have a target size of 10 to 15 million, projects, you know, a third of that size. There is also an issue in terms of the credit or the loans that they take out. I mean, we are talking about nature here, and the period to repay the investment is much longer than 10 years. If you go to a bank, to a standard commercial bank, the loan repayment period generally will be in the order of 10 years, 10 maximum 15 years, if at all. But, you know, the economic life of these assets. And I was glad to see that Willem was saying we are in it for the long term. It's, you know, 20, 30 years. But if you're looking at private sector involvement and you're looking at investors, will want a return earlier on, much earlier on. So, so there is here's a gap that we need to bridge, and we need to actually just change the way we think. Quite clearly, he said that yes, to meet the global need, you need a private sector investment of, you know, about 200 to 300 billion. I think the funding is out there. I mean, when there are investors who are prepared to fund and to come in, but the biggest problem that we've been facing, at least from the pipeline of projects that we've been looking at through the NCFF, is investable projects and opportunities that have an adequate risk-return ratio. we are all in agreement that the return ratios are small, but the projects that have been coming to us need to be structured so that they actually pass the credit risk assessment. And one of our findings is that because some of these are new business models, we have at the beginning a low initial credit quality of our potential borrowers. And that is very difficult with our credit risk department, because what we're trying to prove through the NCFF is that these projects can pass the normal credit risk tests, and they aren't.
Okay.
Right now, what is happening is that the NCFF, the Commission, through life funds, is taking the first loss piece. So they're guaranteeing the funds that we are putting in. What is happening is because of the initial low quality of the credit profile of the borrowers, it results in a higher so it's eating up, let's say, the piece that is being put in to de-risk the investments. So the investments remain relatively risky. And so the challenge is how do we move from public financing mechanisms to these to the application of equity, debt, insurance funds, and so forth. And we need to remove those barriers. And someone mentioned, I think it was Jonathan, he said, yes, we are in a period of a lot of deregulation. But if we don't get the right signals from government, or let's say the private sector gets the right signals from government, and there is no incentive or creation, at least of regulation frameworks, and a creation of a potential market there for these projects, it's going to still remain very patchy. You're not going to get a lot of mainstream. And there, the role of the public sector actually is not to come in with more financing, is actually to set the right signals. And the signals are not into mainstreaming, and a change in the systems and a change in thinking. And I think the point I wanted to make, and I can't remember that. Through the questions, but I think it is key that that we still do not lose the momentum of actually mainstreaming natural capital into all the different sectors. Oh yes, and that was the last point I wanted to make. At the moment, we are still seeing a lot of competition in funding mechanisms. So we do have, still quite a bit of grant funding available, which makes it difficult for initiatives like the NCFF to take off, because you still have access to other grant facilities. And honestly, I mean, I would go for grant financing if I could. It's less complicated. There's less hoops to jump through than if I have to go and apply for a loan or structure a fund for this. And then also in certain sectors, when we talk about mainstreaming, we still have are actually one of the largest barriers into or natural capital into the different sectors, and notably the agricultural sector. With cap and of the subsidies, you will never, and I think for the EU and Europe, the agricultural sector is one of the sectors you're never going to really be able to mainstream and to actually meet your objectives under the biodiversity strategy. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Eva, for your applause. I'm afraid we've run out of time and lunch is being served. But I guess you do see some kind of a role for the EU institutions and also maybe ICN to continue this groundbreaking work because it's uncharted territory. If I listen to your
Absolutely, yes.
as well. Well, thank you very much for joining us from Luxembourg, and hope to see you then soon here in Brussels when the trains are running. Could take
Yes.
a while, and I guess that people will know how to find you if they want to have more.
Yes.
Those were questions. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. All the best. And now we close. Lunch is being served. Thank you very much on behalf also of the Belgian Biodiversity Platform and of ICN Europe to attend. Difficulties. We'll write something of a web story, maybe centered around a few of the presentations. And lunch is being served at the far end on the left. Thank you very much.